Welcome to the Political Economy of the Environment. Today's episode is about the Coase theorem. Back in 1960, the economist Ronald Coase published an article called The Problem of Social Cost, which became one of the most widely cited articles in the economics profession. In it, he examined the problem of market failure caused by the existence of externalities, by effects that aren't captured in market prices, that cause what is efficient from the standpoint of social well-being to depart from what happens in actual real-world markets. And what he proposed was that under certain conditions, as we'll see, rather restrictive conditions, there's no need for government intervention to solve those problems. They could be solved simply by private actors bargaining to reach the efficient solution. And one of the examples Coase gave was of a fire started by sparks from passing railroad engines. A fire in a forest or field, the sparks from the railroad train cause a fire. And Coase said, how could that problem of that external cost created by the passing train be addressed, and how should it be addressed by society? That spark from the passing train example is one illustration of the problem of externalities, external costs that lead to market failures, failures of markets to provide the efficient level of output and the efficient prices that go with that level of output. The idea being that the costs of burning down the field don't enter into the calculation of the railroad company when they're deciding how many trains to run or what precautionary devices to use to prevent sparks from hitting the nearby vegetation. And that problem of external cost, where you're weighing up the benefits to society of the railroad activity in this case, that's the demand curve for the railroads, and you're weighing not only the internal cost to the railroad of providing those services, but also the external cost to get the total social cost, internal plus external, of running the railroad, leads to a prescription as to what the efficient, socially efficient level of railroad services and the associated sparks should really be. And that's usually taken to be the target for government policy, for policies to correct the externality, for example, by requiring the railroads to install some sort of spark prevention controls on their equipment. And Coase said, well, under what conditions might we not need the government to solve the problem after all? And to perform that thought experiment, he said, let's assume. There's a famous let's assume story about economists, which kind of gives you the background for this let's assume way of thinking about such a problem. And the story is that an economist, a physicist, and a chemist are marooned on a deserted island. There's a shipwreck, and they wash up on this deserted island. And what also, luckily for them, or at least potentially lucky, washes up are some crates of canned beans. And the problem is they don't have a can opener. And so they discuss what they should do. And the physicist said, well, if we get this rock and we climb up in that tree and we drop the rock on the can of beans, by my calculations, the force of that falling rock will be enough to break the can open and we'll be able to eat the beans. And the chemist says, I've got an idea. If we boil down, evaporate some salt water in the sunlight here, and we increase the concentration of the chemicals in that ocean water, we'll be able to put that stuff on the top of the can and it'll eat it away, and then we'll be able to pry the lid off. And the economist says, I've got a better idea. And they say, what? What's the better idea? And the economist says, let us assume a can opener. Well, assuming a way to solve a problem is useful as a thought experiment. How useful it is in terms of informing public policy or what we do as a society depends a lot on what's being assumed. In the case of Coase, he said, let us assume two basic conditions. First is that there is a very clear, unambiguous, assignment of property rights to either the creator of the external cost or those who bear the harm, either to the railroad or the people who own the forests or fields nearby, either to the polluter or to the pollutee, the people who are suffering from pollution, for example. Let's assume that it's really clear that one side or the other owns the right in question, the right to protect their field or the right to emit the sparks, the right to pollute or the right to breathe clean air, whatever it may be. Let's assume that's all settled, that property rights have been allocated. And let's assume that there's zero transaction costs. That's to say that the different parties, the ones that are creating the harm and the ones who are bearing the harm, can bargain together with no transaction costs whatsoever. It doesn't cost them anything to sit down at the table and say, well, you know, here's what I would accept, here's what I would pay, and come to an agreement. In other words, it can operate like a market operates. And what Coase said was that if you have those two conditions, you could have a bargain that achieves the correct level of pollution, let's say. The marginal cost of polluting to the people who suffer from it rises as you pollute more and more, or at least that's the stylized facts. And the benefits to the polluter of dumping another ton of pollution into the atmosphere decline as they produce more and more of it, because for one thing, the demand for their product declines as they produce more and more of it. And so if one party or the other has the rights, and if transaction costs are minimal, then they could bargain together and come up with the efficient level of pollution. Moreover, in the most popularized version of the Coase theorem, it said that it doesn't really matter who owns the rights. It doesn't matter if the public owns the right to the air or if the polluter owns the right to the air. It doesn't matter if the railroad has the right to emit the sparks or the landowners have the right not to have their forests burned down. Whichever way it is, they can get together and bargain in this thought experiment world with zero transaction costs and come up with the efficient level of pollution. That's the so-called Coase theorem as it's usually presented. Now let's think a little bit about Coase's two can-opener assumptions. Property rights are clearly and unambiguously assigned. Well, in a lot of real-world cases, that just isn't so. Think about the question of air pollution. Who owns the air? It's not owned by anybody. There's not a formal set of property rights that says it belongs to the polluters, nor is there really a formal set that says it belongs to the public. It's in a kind of gray area. And so that first assumption isn't realistic for a lot of cases that are important real-world cases involving, for example, pollution. Zero transaction costs? I don't think so. Imagine air pollution that afflicts a lot of people, or water pollution, right? They're the pollutees, they're the people harmed. Whether the firm has the right to pollute their air or water, or the people have the right to not have polluted air or water, the idea that you're going to get all those people together to bargain with the firm to come up with the efficient level of pollution means that you're assuming away all the problems of getting all those people to cooperate, to agree, to decide what the right price should be, to negotiate with the firm. Transaction costs that are actually not only big, but maybe insuperable barriers to a bargaining solution. And Coase himself, if you read his article, his point was that in many real-world cases, there isn't a clear assignment of property rights, and there are large and substantial transaction costs, and therefore private bargaining can't solve the problem, and therefore we need government policies in order to redress the problem and try to move society towards correcting the externality. What about the assignment of property rights? Would that matter, or does it not matter to whom the rights to the air or freedom from sparks or whatever are assigned? Well, there's several reasons why it actually might matter. Number one, the transaction costs could be different depending on to whom they're assigned. It might be easier to get the people harmed by pollution together if they're getting together to be paid by the firm for the use of their air or water than if they have to get together to decide who's going to pay. The incentive effects might be quite different depending upon whether the firm has the right to pollute or the public has the right to clean air and clean water. If the firm has the right to pollute, they'd have an incentive to threaten to pollute more so that the public will pay them more not to do it. And if the public has the right to limit pollution, on the other hand, the firm has an incentive to pollute less. This is sometimes called the bribes versus charges controversy in economics. If you're bribing polluters not to do something, they've got an incentive to threaten to do more. That underlies the polluter pays principle. It's one of the reasons why many advocate that in assigning rights, it should be the polluter who pays, not those who suffer from pollution who pay the polluter not to pollute. Furthermore, the assignment of the initial rights might matter because there's a difference between willingness to pay and willingness to accept. Willingness to pay is constrained by ability to pay, and willingness to accept isn't. So if the public has to pay the firm not to pollute, their willingness to pay for that is constrained not only by the problems of the transaction costs of getting together and deciding who's going to pay what, but also by their ability to pay. They may not have that much money, right? So their willingness to pay for clean air may not be that high. On the other hand, if it's the firm that has to pay the public, then they may demand a higher payment from the firm than would otherwise be the case. So the efficient, quote unquote, level of pollution depends or may depend on that initial assignment of property rights. And finally, fairness is a consideration as well. And this is what comes to many people's minds when they think about this question. Right? Fairness in the terms of equity, in terms of who's rich and who's poor. If we're pitting a relatively poor community against a relatively wealthy set of owners of the firm, it may be that people would say, hey, the rights should belong to the people, not to the firm, from the standpoint of fairness. Also, there's another dimension of fairness which has to do with rights. Many of us would argue that people have the right to a clean and safe environment, that that's not a question of something they should have to pay for. It's not a commodity that ought to be distributed on the basis of purchasing power. It's not a privilege that ought to be distributed on the basis of political power. It's a basic human right that we all share in common. And that, in many people's minds, is what's fair. So the assignment of property rights might matter for all of those reasons. What about the Coase theorem itself? Why does it matter? I mean, after all, the assumptions on which it was based are debatable, to say the least. Clear assignment of property rights, zero transaction costs. You don't find that combination in too many real-world externalities. So why talk about the Coase theorem? Well, I think there are two important reasons. One is that the Coase theorem brings out, when you really think about it, and indeed when you read Coase's own article, the need for public policies to protect environmental quality. It brings out the limitations of the bargaining solution, the limitations of the market as a way to solve these problems. And secondly, it brings out the basic underlying issue of the assignment of rights, of property rights, of rights to use the environment, rights to clean air and clean water. This is important in defining the efficient level of pollution, regardless of what policies are used in an effort to attain it. And it poses the underlying question, does the air, or more generally, does the environment belong to the people, or does it belong to those who pollute it? Thank you very much.